and a pleasure to speak with you today about epilepsy. And to do so, I thought I would first provide you a brief overview of what epilepsy is and what epilepsy is not, and then to discuss with you how epilepsy can be a disabling condition. And having discussed the ways in which epilepsy can be disabling, then to propose ways to overcome the challenges of disabling epilepsy, and to suggest to you that India is in a particularly unique position to lead the world in undoing the disabling aspects of epilepsy. There are a number of people I would like to thank, and in particular the Srinivasan family for their support and encouragement over these many years. And my friend and colleague, Professor E.S. Krishnamurthy, for the invitation to be here with you today. His father, Professor Krishnamurthy Srinivas, who I too wish a happy and healthy 75th birthday. I'd also like to acknowledge the many caring physicians and allied health professionals that I've met during my trip here, and also their spouses and family members who are the unsung heroes who allow their husbands and wives to pursue their passion in their work and to spend many long hours each and every day caring for patients with epilepsy. The staff at the T.S. Srinivasan Center for Clinical Neurosciences at VHS Medical Center, who are an amazing and very dedicated group of healthcare professionals, and my colleagues who, for these past couple of days, have worked diligently at the conclave on disabling epilepsy to fashion a consensus statement about the disabling aspects of epilepsy and the role that health policy and, in fact, government has in meeting these challenges. But first, but foremost and above all else, I want to acknowledge the inspiration that we in the healthcare profession derive from our patients with epilepsy and their families, who we have the privilege of seeing day in and day out. And yesterday we heard from two particularly remarkable people, Dharma, a mother of a child with epilepsy, and Ignatius, a gentleman who has had epilepsy his whole life, but despite that is a very productive businessman. And to them I dedicate today's talk. I want to come back to the Srinivasan family because as somebody meeting them for the first time, it's particularly impressive to me how dedicated they are to neuroscience. And it is said in the New Testament, in the book of Luke, that to whom much is given, much is expected. And the famous anthropologist Margaret Mead said, "Never believe that a few caring people can change the world, for indeed that's all who ever have." And I choose these two quotes because, to me, they represent the impact that the Srinivasan family has had. And from what I can gather, and had a chance to speak last night with them, they've exceeded all expectations, and in so doing have improved the health and well-being of people in this country, throughout the country. And I, for one, want to praise and laud them for their vision and generosity and humanism. Now, in preparing for today's talk, I first had to look up in the dictionary what the word oration meant, because this is the first oration I've ever given. And thankfully, with the internet, it's not difficult to find definitions. And there were two definitions given. One is a formal speech, especially given on a ceremonial occasion, and I suppose that's fitting today. And the other is a speech delivered in a high-flown or pompous manner, which really isn't my style, as my friends know. But what I want to focus on is the origin of the word oration from Middle English oration, which means prayer. And what I hope to do after I make my presentation is to come back to you and make a prayer on behalf of people with epilepsy here in India. So the first thing I want to talk about is just what epilepsy is. Epilepsy is a variety of conditions, a variety of brain disorders, which have in common one thing, and that is that they cause seizures intermittently. Now, what is a seizure? A seizure is nothing more than an electrical disruption occurring in the brain, which, depending on where in the brain it is occurring, will result in a variety of different alterations in behavior or awareness or consciousness. You know, the brain is essentially like an electrical battery. It requires very tightly controlled flow of chemicals across the nerve cells to maintain its electrical functioning in a normal way. And when, for unclear reasons, that flow of chemicals across the nerve membranes is disrupted, the consequence can be a sudden surge in electricity, which we think of as a short circuit. And that short circuit temporarily disrupts the function of part of the brain, much as a short circuit would disrupt a certain electrical circuit in one's house or in one's car or motorbike. That's why we sometimes refer to seizures as brainstorms, figuratively speaking, because it is an electrical storm affecting the brain that comes and goes. Now, as you can imagine, since the brain is a very complicated organ and subserves a number of different functions, that the nature of the impairment of behavior caused by a seizure will depend on exactly what part of the brain is affected by the seizure. And consequently, from one person to the next who has epilepsy, the nature of the seizures may be very different, yet they both have epilepsy. The range of alterations in behavior can be as minimal or as mild and inapparent as a funny feeling the person experiences, a strange internal sensation that only they are aware of. But to somebody else, there'd be absolutely no indication something is wrong. Or it can be, at the other extreme, a convulsion, or what we call a tonic-clonic seizure. And for centuries, it was the convulsion that was best known as a type of seizure because it is, of course, the most visually dramatic form of the condition. If the seizure occurs in the part of the brain that is important for memory, then it's likely it will affect awareness or concentration or consciousness. And so the person may look awake, but in fact is not aware of their environment or conscious. And seizures, because they can take so many different forms, are often mistaken as other conditions. For example, daydreaming, particularly in the case of a child who's having what we call absence seizures. They may appear to come in and out of attention as if they're daydreaming. Or misbehaving. Parents often think early on that their child might be misbehaving if they have changes in behavior that are otherwise unexplainable. Or it may be mistaken as a form of mental illness, which is one of the reasons why over the centuries epilepsy has been misunderstood and stigmatized. Or if it occurs in an older individual, it may be mistaken as a heart attack or as somebody in the throes of dying. And it's not unusual for a parent, the first time they witness their child having a convulsion, to be concerned and afraid that their child is dying. Now, if epilepsy means recurrent seizures, and seizures are a symptom of some brain disorder, the next question is what can cause epilepsy? And epilepsy has a number of different possible causes. Anything that can damage the brain can potentially cause a seizure, particularly if it affects certain parts of the brain. But even with the most modern laboratory and neuroimaging tests, up to half the cases of epilepsy are unexplained. There is no apparent cause that we can find for that individual seizure, and that's a major unmet need today, is that we are lacking for an explanation as to the cause of epilepsy in so many people. Epilepsy is the most common serious neurological disorder in the world, affecting somewhere between 0.5 and 1 or 2% of the population, depending on the region of the world. It can begin at any age. When many of us trained, we were taught that epilepsy was a condition that began in childhood, and clearly does begin in childhood for many people. But it can also begin in adolescence, in young adults, in older people, and in seniors. In fact, as the population ages as the overall population ages in many countries around the world, epilepsy is beginning to occur more and more in people over the age of 60 or 65. So much so that it is more likely that a person with epilepsy in my clinic will be over the age of 65 than a child. In other words, more people will be developing epilepsy in later years than in childhood, and that's simply a reflection of the changing demographics of people in the world. Once epilepsy is suspected based on seizures, then typically a series of tests are undertaken to look for the cause, to confirm or substantiate the diagnosis with test results. And so the two most common tests that are used would be either a CAT scan or an MRI scan, looking for abnormalities in the brain structure, and an electroencephalogram, or an EEG, which records the electrical activity of the brain. Like a voltmeter would be used to investigate an electrical circuit. And there are very characteristic abnormalities in the EEG that can support the diagnosis of epilepsy, particularly during a seizure. But again, many people who are diagnosed with epilepsy may have perfectly normal CAT scans or MRI scans or EEGs. Now, when a person with epilepsy goes to see the doctor, there's very little that the doctor can see in that person to make the diagnosis. It's nearly entirely a matter of communication, verbal communication, between the person or their family members and the physician. Because it's usually the case that the seizure occurred sometime in the past, leading to the initial evaluation. What this means is that the accuracy and comprehensiveness of the information discussed with the physician is extremely important in making the diagnosis. And communication is a two-way process, requiring a careful listener and an empathetic physician who is willing to spend the time with the patient and their family to try to understand exactly what happened. They're often dealing with people who are very frightened about what took place and may have no previous medical training to describe what took place in medical terms, and frankly may have not paid enough attention during the seizure because they were so concerned for the well-being of their family member, so that they're not completely able to communicate the details perhaps to the level that the physician would like. And one thing we stress with our trainees and young doctors is the importance of communication, both during that initial visit and from that point forward. It's critical. Now I want to show you a few examples of people having seizures. These are a series of videotapes that were produced by the International League Against Epilepsy, and the patients were quite willing to have their seizures seen in settings like this. And the main reason I'm showing these videos to you is to point out the differences in behavior that can occur from one person to the next who has epilepsy. In all these circumstances, to the left of the screen you'll see a scrolling set of squiggling lines. That's the EEG, or brain waves, being recorded using electrodes that are put onto the scalp. And right about now, this gentleman is starting to feel the seizure coming on. And if you were a casual observer, you may not fully realize that there was anything amiss, but he's very well aware of the sensations of having the seizure. And the purpose of him having this EEG is to document that the seizure, that in fact his changes in behavior are seizures. As you can imagine, events like this would not necessarily be thought of as epilepsy to a family member or even to the individual. And for that reason, it's likely that our estimates of the prevalence of epilepsy are low, that there may be other people experiencing seizures on a recurring basis, subtle perhaps as this, that don't recognize it as a medical condition and therefore don't seek medical attention. Here's another example. This is a young boy, and in this particular case, the seizure is extremely brief. It's happening now. He's aware of his environment during this period of time. He can tell you later what took place. And then the seizure ends, and it's just that brief. So of course, if the family member missed it, it would be as if it didn't occur. What's fortunate, though, is that he is aware when he has a seizure, and what he's getting ready to do now is record on a piece of paper that he just had a seizure. This is a more dramatic form of epilepsy. This is a seizure that begins on one side of this gentleman's body and then spreads to become a tonic-clonic seizure, or which is another way of saying convulsion. And he has some feeling that a seizure is about to occur. That's why he took his glasses off. So he has a warning, what we sometimes call an aura, which is fortunate for those patients who have that because they can take measures to protect their safety if possible. You see the seizure beginning on his left arm, and he's conscious at this point, but soon will lose consciousness as the seizure spreads throughout his brain, spreads throughout the networks of brain cells, causing the tonic-clonic convulsion. And this is, as I mentioned earlier, the most visually dramatic form of epilepsy, which has been recognized for centuries and accounts for most of the stigmatization and misunderstanding of epilepsy. Now at this point, the people here are helping him down, and there are very specific safety maneuvers that can help reduce the likelihood of injury to somebody at this point. There are other things that have been talked about or passed along, such as putting a spoon in the mouth, which are actually counterproductive and are not to be done. And as this seizure continues, this is now the tonic-clonic phase of the seizure. It will eventually end. And you see on the EEG the manifestations of the seizure electrically, bursts of electrical discharges that get progressively shorter in duration. Then the seizure itself ends, which begins a period of time we call the postictal state, or the after effects of the seizure. And the after effects of the seizure can last minutes to even hours, or in the case of a 60 or 70 or 80-year-old can last perhaps even days. And I'll explain some of the symptoms that can occur during the postictal state shortly. And I'll show you one other example, and this example points out how unusual or bizarre a seizure can look, and this gentleman is now having a seizure. And if this is the way that a seizure affects a person, it's not unexpected that somebody else may think this is a form of mental illness or a psychiatric condition, and it's not unusual for somebody to be referred initially to see a psychiatrist only to be found to have epilepsy. And it's just a matter of where in the brain the seizure occurs to result in behavior that we saw. So you can see how different from one person to the next epilepsy can be. And that is a source of confusion to the public, as well as to clinicians not trained in epilepsy. But it's perfectly understandable given the complexity of the brain and the impact that these short circuits can have depending on where in the brain the seizure occurs. Now, patients experience seizures, though, in their own way as well. They don't experience it the same way we see it. And this is what patients will tell us in the office. And those who are aware of their seizures often have symptoms that are extremely unpleasant or foreign, and these occur in a stereotyped way during their seizures and influence how they feel about their epilepsy and the understanding that they come to about their condition. This particular patient, as you can see, describes her seizures as electrical firings that affect her visions, which flourish, and she hallucinates indescribable visions. And then she feels virtual slivers slicing her throat as she draws the air in to describe them. And then she feels physically moved, sucked down into the explosion, fumbling through the chaos, landing disembodied from the intensity. For her, this is the reality of her seizure. She's a very gifted artist, and this is how she draws the experience of herself having a seizure. Her head disconnected from the body, we call that an out-of-body experience. You can see the heat in her body. So this is, we can't possibly see this happening to her as observers, but to her this is what she experiences when she has a seizure. No wonder that she lives in fear of having a seizure. It's an extremely unpleasant experience. I mentioned that a seizure has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and then it's followed by the postictal period, the after effects, which because of the duration, often lasting much longer than the seizure itself, can be more disruptive to life than the seizure. And there are a number of symptoms that commonly occur during the postictal period as well. First and foremost, fatigue or the need to sleep, and it's quite remarkable how after a 2 or 3 minute seizure, a person may need to sleep for minutes to hours. There's confusion as if waking up from an operation, change in perception, headache or other bodily pains, particularly with a convulsion that may have resulted in injury, and a variety of changes in mood such as embarrassment or depression, even suicidality. And it's worth pointing out that we have no specific treatment for the postictal period other than trying to control the seizure itself. And yet this, for many patients with epilepsy, is the most disruptive part of the condition. Here's how another person with epilepsy described their postictal period. She says that after a seizure, she gets an overwhelming sense that everything she knows intellectually to be present is actually distant in time and space, like the sort of sense associated with the recollection of an old memory, or déjà vu. With that, she has a powerful sense of anguish, pain, and loneliness. She doesn't remember the seizure, but she remembers how she feels after the seizure, and this is how she draws it. And can you imagine experiencing this sense of floating in space until your mind returns back to normal, of being disembodied and mutilated in this way? It's quite remarkable, and again, no wonder that she lives in fear of having seizures, because she will experience this when she has a seizure. And there's no way that she can talk herself out of it or avoid it. It is a obligatory part of having a seizure for her. After a seizure, a person might feel ugly, and they feel that they look ugly to other people, as shown here. By the way, I should mention that I collect the art of people with epilepsy, and most of the art I'm showing has been drawn by somebody with epilepsy. This is a German artist who has epilepsy, again showing how she feels. She believes that she looks like a like an ape after a seizure. And for her, that is actually the way she wants to look after a seizure, which is quite sad. And the reason for that is because one time during the postictal period, when she was helpless and not in full control of her faculties, she was raped. And so she hopes that to others, particularly would-be perpetrators, that she appears ugly and undesirable after a seizure. I've had patients who have been robbed if they've had a seizure out on the street, carrying a package, Christmas package, for example. I'm sure my colleagues have had similar stories as well. So that gives you a sense of what seizures may look like to other people and also what seizures may feel like to those with the condition. Well, the good news is that the outlook for complete control or suppression of seizures is quite good for approximately 2 out of 3 patients with epilepsy. With the emergence of a number of new medications over the past 10 and 15 years, this figure has increased somewhat. However, the problem is that despite having complete control of their seizures, about half of this group of patients will be experiencing side effects from their medications on a daily basis. Side effects such as fatigue, trouble concentrating, decreased short-term memory, double vision, or trouble with balance. For our medications to stop seizures, they need to get into the brain, and the medications circulate throughout the brain and can have side effects on other normal neurological functions. 1 in 3 patients, approximately, with epilepsy who have access to medication and can take it on a continuing basis, unfortunately cannot gain full control of their seizures. And while their seizures may be reduced in frequency or severity, they nonetheless still occur. But for those patients who have limited or no access to seizure medications, nearly all are at risk for ongoing or continuing seizures. And we call that the treatment gap. Epilepsy, by virtue of the fact that seizures, as you saw, can impair a person's ability to protect themselves, can result in injury, ranging from broken bones, such as the spine or the skull, fractured teeth, burns if a seizure occurs while somebody is near an open flame or a stove. In some sections of Africa, epilepsy is known as Burns disease because they cook with open fires. And horrifically, because epilepsy is thought to be due to evil spirits, in some villages, if a person has a seizure, they'll be left to burn to death in the fire. I had a patient who had a seizure and fell in front of an oncoming train, lost a leg. We've all seen patients in our office who wear the battle scars of their epilepsy because of the injuries that they sustained. So protecting the safety of somebody at risk of having seizures is a major unmet medical need at the present time. Epilepsy, in fact, can be fatal. There are patients who die, and we believe that it's related to their epilepsy. Some of these patients commit suicide from the severe depression associated in many patients with epilepsy. Others have an accidental death, such as drowning, a bicycle accident where they may veer in front of an oncoming car. I had a patient, a young man who was about to graduate from high school, who en route to a party had a seizure in the back seat of the car. His friends laid him on the back seat face up. He vomited, which is not infrequent, and the vomit went into his throat, and he asphyxiated or choked to death. There's another form of death which is referred to as SUDEP, sudden unexpected death in epilepsy, which occurs approximately in the range of 1 in 300 to 1 in 1,000 patient years, meaning that if we follow a group of 300 patients over the course of the year, one person may die from this. Typically, the death occurs during the night, and we have really no complete understanding as to why this occurs. And we've all lost patients to SUDEP. Here again, it's of course the ultimate in complications of epilepsy. and our ability to identify which particular people are at greatest risk is poor. Many parents who learn about this wind up sleeping with their child because they're so afraid that the child will have a seizure during the night. I mentioned that our treatments often cause side effects, and patients need to unfortunately balance seizure control versus side effects. We've all had patients who've said they'd rather have a seizure once a month than be impaired day in and day out to the point where they can't function because of side effects. Epilepsy affects the family, particularly parents in the case of a child with epilepsy, or spouses, or siblings. And the impact on the family goes in both directions. The family can influence the person with epilepsy as well. And we wind up not only treating our patients with epilepsy, but counseling the family, which is a very important part of the process. Epilepsy is misunderstood by the public, and I'll get into some of those reasons in just a moment. Here's a drawing done by actually an Indian person with epilepsy trying to express in her way what it's like to have double vision and to be unable to focus visually throughout the course of the day. And typically this will come on within a couple hours of taking medication and persist for a while. And can you imagine having to put up with this day in and day out in order to avoid having seizures? Epilepsy is a chronic condition, and as we've seen, many people with epilepsy continue to have seizures or side effects from medication. And like any other chronic illness, some people with epilepsy turn to other forms of therapy to try to get relief, such as herbal therapy in this case. In the United States, these are called dietary supplements. This happens to be a herbal formula in traditional Chinese medicine for stroke. Or throughout the world, people may turn to alternative healthcare practitioners, in this case, a shaman. This is a photo from a paper that's in press by a group of epileptologists. This is a picture taken of a patient in Chandigarh, I might be mispronouncing that, here in India. And this patient sought out the help of this shaman because his seizures were not well controlled. Now, theories about the causation of epilepsy go back thousands of years. It's human nature, as we were saying earlier during a press conference, when we can't explain something and when we're afraid of what we're seeing, that we tend to try to rationalize or put it in terms that we can understand. And over the centuries, the most common explanation for why seizures occur is the influence of supernatural powers, particularly evil spirits. And consequently, religious leaders over the centuries have been called on to treat people with epilepsy. And there's a famous story about a boy with epilepsy in the New Testament. And in that story, a father brings his son into the presence of Jesus to be cured of his epilepsy. And the story is repeated several times in the New Testament. And it's quite a remarkable story to read. But as Jesus is talking to the father, the child then has a seizure in the story and lays motionless after the seizure's over. As you saw, the gentleman who was helped to the floor was motionless after the seizure. And back then it was taken to mean that the person had died, when our explanation today might be it was a post-ictal state. At that point, Jesus, who in the times believed that seizures were caused by evil spirits that literally seized the individual, treated the patient, or treated the boy, if you will, by casting out the evil spirits. And that is depicted here in this painting called Transfiguration, which is painted by Rubens, a Flemish painter from the early 1600s. And you can see the boy here in the midst of a seizure, his parents here. And I show this picture at this time because it very accurately depicts the fear that's going through the minds of the parents during the seizure. And these are quotes from parents I worked with who described what they were feeling when they witnessed their child having a seizure for the first time. His breathing was irregular, he was turning blue, he looked to me like he was dying. Another parent said, "I literally felt as if my son's life was slipping through my hands, and I was helpless to stop the process." And over 400 years ago, Rubens or his apprentice, whoever painted this part of the painting, must have known parents of a child with epilepsy, because you can see on their faces how horrified they are. And many parents, having witnessed a child have a first convulsion, develop almost a post-traumatic stress disorder and are terrified of their child having further seizures. And that can have a number of consequences, including overprotecting the child, which in the long run can be counterproductive. Now, the painting is also very perceptive in the way it depicts the people in the environment who are witnessing the seizure. When you talk to people who have witnessed a seizure, particularly a tonic-clonic seizure, if they're being honest with you, the first thing they'll say is they had the urge to run away, to flee, to get away. It wouldn't necessarily be the politically correct thing to do, but it brings, if you're not familiar with this, the first time you see it, it's very frightening, and there's no way around that. And many people feel like running away and getting away from the situation. Can you imagine being a person with epilepsy, knowing that if you have one of these events, people around you want to get away from you as fast as possible? And you can see that here in the body language of the person seeing the seizure. He wants to put distance between himself and the child. So extremely perceptive. Now moving on from the medical aspects of epilepsy, the seizures, the side effects of medication, epilepsy is also a condition with psychosocial consequences. And I mention this because that becomes part of the disabling aspect of having the condition. So people with epilepsy often feel alone or isolated. They may not know anyone else with epilepsy at all, and they may not know people who can really truly understand what they're going through, particularly if they're aware of part or all of their seizure. Many people with epilepsy suffer from low self-esteem, depression, anxiety, and the depression or anxiety often has a greater impact on their life because it occurs on a daily basis than do the intermittent seizures. And it's only the infrequent neurologist, though, who understands that and works with the patient to identify and treat the mood disorder that may go with it. Depression is under-recognized and under-treated in people with epilepsy. This is a painting of a woman in the US who suffers from depression associated with her epilepsy. There are a number of scientific theories about why depression occurs in as many perhaps as 30 or 40% of our patients. But the fact is that it does, and it often reaches a level that requires therapy unto itself. The sense of isolation or being alone is one that is commonly held by patients, particularly if they develop epilepsy in childhood before they've established a social network. This is a very bleak, personless, if you will, depiction of the day in the life of a person with epilepsy, from sunrise in the foreground to moonrise at the horizon. The cracks in the bridge represent the gaps of time that are the consequence of the person's seizures. And for him, this is his existence day in and day out, devoid of people. For some people with epilepsy, the only warmth they experience from other people is in the doctor's office, where they finally encounter people who understand them, who have some sense of what they go through. And we see patients who are doing well from the standpoint of their seizures, and we say, well, I don't need to see you every couple months anymore. Let's make it a year. And they complain, why can't I want to see you in 2 months from now? And the reason is because that we may be the only friendly, empathetic, understanding people that they encounter on a day-to-day basis. So for some people, they just simply don't want to leave the house, and they become homebound. It may be that only in their bedroom do they feel, like a person. Part of the reason for that is that epilepsy is highly stigmatized. It's one of the most stigmatized medical conditions. And stigma can be in the mind of the person, we call that perceived stigma, or it can be actual stigma as occurs in discrimination or in a person being denied some benefit. But I think it's really important to understand that a person with epilepsy may believe others have a certain attitude towards them when they may or may not. If they don't, we call that perceived stigma. And perceived stigma can be just as disabling as enacted or actual stigma. The diagnosis of epilepsy brings certain legal restrictions. Professor Krishnamurthy mentioned driving earlier. Often a driver's license is lost for a period of time. There may be decreased opportunities for activities that we take for granted, such as education, employment, socialization, marriage, starting a family. And as a result of any or all of these psychosocial consequences, epilepsy often prevents a person from living up to their full potential, from succeeding in life in a way that they are capable of, or making a significant contribution to society. Here's a very interesting and sad picture. The artist here is German, and he's flat on his back, just waking up from a seizure. And what he sees is people looking down at him. Both literally, they're looking down at him on the ground, but also figuratively looking down at him, meaning in a denigrating way. People with epilepsy who perceive this feel that sometimes they're below the level of, they're in a different level of society. And they may come to believe that everyone they meet on the street views them in that way. And that would be an example of perceived stigma, which is exactly what this person, a photographer with epilepsy, is describing in this photograph. Here he sets up the scene to show a clown, which is in the middle of this busy railroad station. And the statement he's making is that he, as the person with epilepsy, believes he looks like a clown to everyone around him, meaning that he looks like a total different person in society. But the reality, which this photographer recognizes, is that no one is paying attention to him, that he is being viewed just like anybody else in that railroad station. So that in the minds of these other people, he looks like a normal person. But because in this case, the person with epilepsy believes he is a clown or an object of ridicule in society, he tends to engage less in society, and that perceived stigma is a disability, and one that is very difficult for us to help a patient get past. Now, in previous decades and centuries, people with epilepsy were dealt with by removing them to a special place, a colony, for example, epileptic colony, much like people with leprosy would be removed from society. The last such colony in the United States closed in the 1950s, but these were throughout Europe and throughout the world. This is a drawing that appeared in a Parisian magazine in the early 1800s, showing people at an epileptic colony. And it depicted these people as comical figures in a very denigrating way, which was politically correct at the time. Stigma or discrimination is perhaps not as overt as it was in the past, but still occurs. And people with epilepsy can also feel marginalized or dehumanized by medical tests and by physicians. Not that we intend to do that, but if the person with epilepsy thinks that they're nothing more than an MRI scan or an EEG or a seizure drug level to the clinician, they feel less a person. This is the artist from India who is showing this and what she felt like when she had an EEG test, that she felt this really was dehumanizing. And here's a patient who expressed this sentiment by creating what appears to be an MRI scan with his hands across it, saying, "No, I'm not just a brain. I'm a whole person." These are reminders to us that who is before us is a person, is somebody, a member of a family, and not simply a test result or a person with a blood level. Now, that is what epilepsy is. What is epilepsy not? Epilepsy is not a curse. It's not witchcraft. It's not the realization of a sin in a previous generation. It's not equivalent to mental illness. It's not something to be feared or rejected or avoided. It's not contagious. And it is also not a supernatural gift or a blessing, which is culturally the view in some parts of the world, such as among the Hmong people, H-M-O-N-G, which is a group who originated in Laos and Cambodia, for whom a person with epilepsy has one foot in this world and one foot in the world to come, and is viewed as having a gift, a supernatural gift. There are many people today who do not agree with this slide, for whom epilepsy is a curse, is witchcraft, is a mental illness, or is contagious. I'm ashamed to say that in the United States, a survey of adolescents done a few years ago revealed that half of the adolescents believed that epilepsy was contagious, that you can catch epilepsy by simply watching a seizure. Now, it used to be that physicians believed that as well. I have a textbook from the mid-1800s by Sutherland, which says that you can contract epilepsy by watching a seizure. And the treatment was, of course, to remove the person with epilepsy out of sight to one of those epileptic colonies. But we have an obligation to educate the public that epilepsy is not these things. It's a brain disorder. This notion that epilepsy is due to evil spirits, again, dates back centuries. And here is another depiction of that scene from the New Testament in which Christ is casting out the evil spirit. And in this particular version, you can see a cloud leaving the child's mouth. That's the evil spirit leaving the child. I should mention that the very interesting part of the story after that is that Christ recommends a couple ongoing therapies to the Father, one of which is prayer, and I think we need to understand more about the potential benefits of prayer. And the other recommendation was fasting. And fasting is usually the first step in the special diet that we often utilize for children with very frequent seizures, because it alters body chemistry in a way that may be beneficial for seizures. So I'd now like to transition from what epilepsy is, both medically as well as psychosocially, what it's not, to a discussion of why epilepsy can be disabling. And to do that, I'd like to share with you a few quotes from patients with epilepsy here in India that I collected and have in a book called Brainstorms. It's a book of stories from people, in this case with epilepsy, from around the world. And most of these stories reflect, in the person's own words, some of the issues we've already talked about. For example, the first patient, age 48, says she started having seizures when she was 17. In her language, it's called mergi. And in the Marwari community, it is regarded as a curse of God. She wrote this not more than 5 years ago or so. And her family members consider it a curse from God. The next person, age 29, was 9 years old when she had her first seizure. A family friend assisted her over the years, and eventually, when she reached marriageable age, proposed marriage to her. Her parents agreed, but his mother objected, the groom's mother objected, because of the woman's epilepsy, saying it was too risky to marry an unknown who may have a dangerous illness. And I've learned so much over the past few days about the extent to which epilepsy can be a serious issue with regard to marriage, consequences of disclosing the condition or not disclosing it, hiding it, taking seizure medications as vitamins because of the age-old misunderstanding about epilepsy, and the fact that it can be, up until 8 years ago here in India, automatic grounds for divorce. That was only changed by an amendment to the Marriage Act in 1999. The next patient, age 35, said when she had her first seizure, her mother thought it was because her teacher had scolded her. When she had another seizure, it was the mother believing it was because she had refused to give an apple to a beggar, and she had seizures all the time. In this case, the mother attributes the child's seizures to things that she does on a daily basis rather than a brain condition that requires treatment and should be dealt with by the physician. The next patient lives in Punjab, where the illness is called Dora, considered to be due to supernatural powers, and nobody understands what she goes through. The last two stories here, age 26, neither relatives nor family friends have assisted in arranging marriage. She actually met a young man that she wants to marry, and her family members are against disclosing the epilepsy to the young man. And her physician similarly told her not to disclose until she has her first issue, or child. But she recognizes this is a gamble. I was talking to Professor Krishnamurthy Srinivas earlier about how he counsels young women and families so that this is all out in the open and it's understood and can be dealt with productively. And the last patient, age 38, says she stopped attending all social gatherings for 1 year after developing epilepsy and cried all the time. She's not able to do her own shopping. She's afraid to travel alone, and it has affected the quality of her life. So we can learn from people living with epilepsy how it can be disabling, how it can adversely impact the quality of life. And so as we then focus on the disabling aspects of epilepsy, we can see that epilepsy can be disabling for a number of reasons, including seizures, side effects of medication, mood disorders such as depression or anxiety, sexual dysfunction, which can be both physical from the epilepsy as well as a side effect from the medication or because of depression, dependency on other people, lack of independence, worrying about the next seizure, which comes up time and time again in surveys of people with epilepsy. Is the worst thing about having epilepsy is the unpredictability of that next seizure. And there's absolutely no way for many people with epilepsy to know when they're going to have a seizure, and they live therefore in constant fear. Anxiety of the parents about that next seizure, or will they die? Will my child die from a seizure or die during the night? And the stigma. So disabling epilepsy then is when a person is unable to live up to their full potential because of any medical or psychosocial aspect of having epilepsy. It's not just about having seizures, it's not just about side effects, but it's about any life life-changing consequence of having epilepsy in the broadest sense. Which brings us to the final topic, and that is, how then can we meet the challenges of disabling epilepsy? And here on the slide, I present to you the stakeholders in this process, the groups of people who are in the best position working collectively to meet the challenge of disabling epilepsy. Physicians, the media, who are represented here today, government, foundations and philanthropists, who play a major role in educating the public, educating physicians, and who support research and advocate for reforms. Role models, people who are willing to publicly disclose their epilepsy and stand before others and serve as role models to encourage their peers to speak up and speak out about their epilepsy, as we've seen with other patients in other conditions such as AIDS or even depression or cancer. And of course, researchers who hold out the best hope for meeting the unmet medical needs we've talked about. The goal in meeting the challenges of disabling epilepsy is to replace disability with abilities and to move from being disabled to enabled. How can physicians do this? Well, physicians need to approach the care of patients with epilepsy from a different perspective than perhaps they were trained. When we were trained, we were taught to focus on the seizures, the side effects, perhaps the serum concentrations of medications. But as we've seen, that is necessary but not sufficient. There's more to it than just that. And this is a quote from William Lennox, a famous Boston-based neurologist, child neurologist, who made this point over 50 years ago, and saying that as physicians, we need to match modern drug and surgical therapy with practical socio-psychological therapy, to be concerned not only with the turbulent brain waves on the EEG, but with disturbed emotions. He was saying at that time what we are discussing this afternoon. The media plays an extremely important role in this process. And by media, I'm referring to print media, TV, movies, books. Typically, epilepsy is portrayed in a very negative way, especially in movies or in TV shows. The most dramatic, unusual, perhaps, form of epilepsy is often shown for dramatic purposes. Likewise, the words that are used in newspaper stories can unfortunately perpetuate the misunderstanding or the myths about epilepsy. And it's the media that reaches the most people over the longest period of time, and is therefore in the best position to be part of the educational process and to portray epilepsy accurately and realistically, to emphasize the abilities of people with epilepsy, not just their disabilities, and to distinguish between the person with epilepsy and their disorder, to refer to a person who has epilepsy as a person with epilepsy rather than as an epileptic, which is a way of differentiating the individual from their condition. To refer to somebody as an epileptic throughout their entire life conveys the impression that they and their epilepsy are one and the same. Likewise, to refer to their seizures perhaps as not being controllable or not being controlled by medication, but not to refer to the person as uncontrolled. How often we'll read a story about the uncontrolled epileptic. It's not that the person is uncontrolled, it's that their seizure is uncontrolled. For the person with epilepsy, the notion of control is one of the most central themes in their lives, because by nature they can't control their seizures, but they tend to want to be able to control many other aspects of their life. And to be referred to time and time again as uncontrolled is very difficult for them. The government has a key role as well by enacting through law measures to protect and preserve the rights of people with epilepsy, not to restrict or deny access to important activities for people with epilepsy. And I applaud Dr. Krishnamurthy for leading a group here to propose to the state government of Tamil Nadu ways in which they can protect the rights of people with epilepsy, to ensure access to educational opportunities, to employment, transportation assistance, assistance with medication, to help them get on a footing to be able to move forward with their lives. We learned yesterday about laws in Germany that do this. We've made attempts to do this in the U.S. as well. And I look forward to learning about the success of the efforts here in this state as well as other states in India. Government also has a role to promote public health programs to eradicate some of the common causes of epilepsy, such as head injury. I understand that the helmet laws here in India or in this state vary from period to period. Head injury is a very common cause of epilepsy, and of course the extent of brain damage can be mitigated by wearing a helmet. Common everyday measures that can lessen the likelihood of developing epilepsy. I believe the government has a role in promoting education in these areas to prevent epilepsy from occurring in the first place. Foundations and philanthropists can and do play a major role in supporting public education, education of physicians, support groups for people with epilepsy, web-based education, web-based ways of interacting with other people. The Indian Epilepsy Society and the Indian Epilepsy Association are very active in this area. I'm affiliated with a website called epilepsy.com where over 200,000 people a month come to our website, and many of them chat with one another to share experiences and to develop a sense of community so that that sense of isolation is lessened. Philanthropists also have a key role in supporting research, particularly at an early stage, at a time when it may be viewed as too high risk to other grant-giving organizations or industry. And I want to show you a short video of a philanthropist from the U.S. who took on this challenge, started a group called the Epilepsy Therapy Project, which has given out over $5 million in research support, particularly for early stage research. He has a daughter with epilepsy, as you'll see.
My name is Warren Lammert. I founded the Epilepsy Therapy Project together with other parents of young children with severe epilepsy and with leading clinicians and research scientists. My 10-year-old daughter Sylvie lives with daily seizures, and she is far from alone. Of the 3 million people in the United States and 50 million worldwide who have epilepsy, approximately 1/3 live with active seizures despite all available therapies. Another third achieve control with medications that have unacceptable side effects. I helped start the Epilepsy Therapy Project to raise money for new, more effective treatments. We provide both direct economic support and direction from our scientific and business advisory boards to turn promising research into new therapies for patients. We seek out those therapies which we believe will have the greatest impact on patients' lives in a time frame that is relevant to people living with epilepsy today. Developing new therapies, however, takes a great deal of money, and epilepsy is badly underfunded. That's why we need your help. Even a small donation can make a difference to those who, like Sylvie, need help to bring their seizures under control. Please join and support the Epilepsy Therapy Project. Thank you.
Role models can be extremely important, but often difficult to come by. Because epilepsy is so stigmatized, many people who are in the public view are unwilling to share their epilepsy with the world. And we know many celebrities who have epilepsy, but are unwilling to make it public. And role models can be particularly powerful in getting people with epilepsy to comply with medical therapy, to get on with their lives. This is a young woman who's the goaltender for the women's Olympic hockey team, who came out and publicly acknowledged her epilepsy and has been very influential among young people in the United States. And finally, to meet the challenges of disabling epilepsy, we need to make advances through research to understand and resolve every aspect of disabling epilepsy, whether it's seizures, side effects of medication, the mood disorders, social disabilities we've spoken about, ways to avoid injury or dying as a consequence of having epilepsy, and stigma. Each of these areas requires an intense effort to better understand through research, and then programs to actively address and resolve these areas. Now, I'd like to conclude with what I intend to be an upbeat message to our friends here in Chennai and from throughout India. And that is that I'm convinced, having been here now my second time, that India is in a unique position to meet the challenges of disabling epilepsy. For one thing, India is blessed with brilliant physicians, healthcare professionals, wonderful medical centers, scientists and engineers, technologists, advanced technologies, world-class pharmaceutical and biotech companies, passionate advocates, as we've met these past couple days, committed people with epilepsy and their families, generous philanthropists. And at the same time, India is challenged by a huge number of people with epilepsy. Perhaps 1 in 5 people with epilepsy around the world live here in India. And it's estimated that over 500,000 new cases of epilepsy occur in this country. And there is a huge treatment gap, a huge number of people who do not have access to or cannot afford medications on a continual basis, and consequently suffer seizures for lack of availability of medication. In fact, when I calculated the number of people in this country that do not have regular access to seizure medications, it's 3 times the total number of people in the US who have epilepsy, which is astounding. And India is also challenged by stigma, which is entrenched for centuries. But I think India is in a position now, the stakeholders, if they come together in a creative alliance, bringing science together with technology, business interests, philanthropy, and government, I believe that there are the components in place, if put together, to demonstrate to the world how to effectively close the diagnosis and treatment gaps and to eliminate disabling epilepsy. What will success look like if that happens? Somebody who is unable to function because of seizures or side effects may become a famous writer one day, such as the list shown here. These are all people thought to have epilepsy. Writers, world leaders, artists, musicians, actors. Somebody in a village who's having seizures for lack of access to medication could be the next brilliant musician. Well, I want to conclude by coming back to my definition of oration. I hope my speech wasn't too formal, and I certainly hope it wasn't high-flown or pompous. But I do want to take this opportunity to offer a prayer to you today. And my prayer for India is that there not be a single Indian who has a single seizure for lack of access to treatments or because of inability to pay. That all people in India with epilepsy live up up to their full potential, enabled to derive fullest meaning from life, and that India shows the world how to close and eliminate the diagnosis and treatment gaps. If that happens, what will success look like? We'll have people saying, I have epilepsy, but now epilepsy doesn't have me. How can I thank you for giving me back my life? Thank you very much.